Thank you so much, Jorge. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I want to start off by saying that it is very difficult to be undertaking this conversation, particularly because we are on the unceded and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and many other Coast Salish nations. So when we talk about the situation in Palestine, for most of us, we immediately recognize the remarkable resonance of what it means to be living within a settler colonial society. And for most of us, we're also beginning to do this personal unpacking, recognizing that being settlers, whether we showed up last week or our foreparents arrived here 20, 30, 50, 60, 100 years ago, we are still part of the architecture of the settler colonial project. And so I thank you for coming out here today, because I know that with the incredible prohibition on the types of conversations we're having, it's not easy to show up. So I thank you for showing up. This alone is one small step towards decolonizing our own hearts and souls. Thank you. So I'm here today because I was asked to be here, but I am incredibly honored to be with you, Omar, on so many levels. And you are familiar to many people for the work that you've done previously, but if I may venture to say so, this particular work, right, which I feel I have the privilege to hold in my hand, is an extraordinary work. And it's an extraordinary work for so many different reasons. I'm going to reserve my own thoughts and reflections now, but I will eventually share them. but I think it's more important to hear from you. The first question that I have for you is, what made you write the book? Not the tweet, but what made you write this book? And was this book being written subconsciously, or did you actively decide, I need to narrativize and render my autobiographical experiences with the genocide of a people into something tangible that can be read and understood and interacted with?
Thank you so much for doing this. First of all, I appreciate it. I don't think there is a sort of more accurate or glaring refutation of the idea that we live in a meritocracy than you and me sitting on this stage and me doing most of the talking. That feels just wrong. But I'm grateful for this, and I'm grateful for you all being here. In very early November of 2023, my editor was in town. I live just south of Portland. And he was there for the book festival, and we were getting dinner afterwards, and I was raving and ranting about the one thing I've sort of been raving and ranting about for weeks, which is this idea that I don't know who the hell I am in this part of the world anymore. Since the age of 5, I've been oriented towards this part of the world. It's the reason I sound the way I do. And I often say that if I called any of you up and said my name was John Smith, you'd probably believe me, right? I'm not far away. I've spent a lot of my life learning how to be not far away. And suddenly all of that had gone to shit, because I felt like when push comes to shove, the things I had made myself believe in with respect to this part of the world that allowed me to hold this orientation felt like they were shaky, if not falling apart entirely. And I think my editor was just so sick of hearing me ramble about this that at one point he was like, okay, you should write about it. You should go. And I had been sort of sketching my thoughts, because it's all I know how to do. I often talk about writing as my first avenue of retreat. When the world doesn't make sense to me, I go and try to figure it out on the page, and I never do. It's just, that's the fire exit, you know? And so I did that, and there was an element of freedom to it, in the sense that I didn't think there was any way in hell this was going to get published. And so you can just sit there and you can write. And apparently I have a really good agent. I don't know what happened. They wanted to buy the book, and suddenly, the first draft was done in March, I think. And then suddenly it was going to become this public-facing thing. And a lot of the work from that point on was to not let the coward take over. Because I'm a huge coward. I leech courage wherever I can get it. I can't generate my own. And as soon as you know, oh, this is going out into the world, there is an instinct then to do essentially what I'm doing right now. When there's more than two people in the room, there's a performative aspect. There's always you can't be in this kind of situation and not put on some kind of costume. And to try and keep that away from this became the more difficult sort of narrative challenge. But in terms of how the book is structured, which is a sort of interweaving of my life experiences of growing up on the other side of the planet, oriented towards here, the journalism and the foreign assignments where I saw the faraway arm of the empire, all of that stuff, it became very difficult for me to sort of be writing this kind of book and not engage with the extent to which I am indicted in all of this. I am a part of it. First of all, in a very practical sense, I'm killing those kids. My tax money's paying for that. But also in terms of the narrative and rhetorical devices that are available to me to look away from that, which I could do, right? I could do without any real consequence outside what it does to my soul. And so all of that sort of worked its way into the narrative. But the central starting point was that you're waking up every morning and you're seeing video, audio evidence of the worst things human beings can do to one another. And you're told over and over again that if you oppose this in some way, you're a horrible human being. And what do you do with that? What do you do with the machinery of that? I sat down and wrote. And I don't know if the result is worth a damn, but it's the only thing I know how to do.
I'm flabbergasted and shocked at the extent to which you're self-deprecating about this, because I mean,
it's because you don't know me so well. We've only met like a couple of times, right?
That's true. So, but I absolutely understand what it means for one to feel a sense of cowardice, particularly given the degree and extent of privilege that we possess, in contrast to those who are on the receiving end of missiles and munition and tanks and firepower and starvation and all those other sort of incredible mechanisms of collective dehumanization. And so it does seem like a very, very, very small sort of drop in the bucket to be able to stand up or wear a kufiya, or wear a watermelon earring or something along those lines. But what you've done is, and I'm not going to pat your back. I'll pat your back on the incredible.
I was just fishing for compliments. I didn't mean a word I said.
I'm trying my best not to. Yeah. You baited me, and I'm going to fall for it. But no, I think what I want to say here is that what you've done is also an act of confrontation. While on one level I recognize the sort of the sense of cowardice or kind of the fear, the personal fear associated with what it means to put this discourse, these narratives, these challenges out there. But nevertheless, whether it's the desire to be able to sleep better at night or to reconcile with a moral compass, you ended up producing a book that is an unadulterated condemnation of empire in all of its permutations and all of its manifestations, using the pure and simple innocence of childhood as a true indicator and litmus test for that. So that alone is, in my opinion, not really a cowardly act. Or maybe what will transpire in the coming months as a result of publishing it may prove otherwise. But I wanted you to kind of help us think about what it means to take a stand. Did you intend for this book to eventually be a stand?
I think it's the kind of book that sort of barges in through the door, pretending to want to pick a bunch of fights. Mm-hmm. And so people have punched back, and they have every right to. I know what I've written. But for me, the sort of the defining aftertaste of this book is a kind of uncertainty. Again, going back to this notion of not knowing who the hell I am anymore, because this thing that I've been rooted to since I was 5 years old has come unrooted. I don't know who I am on the other side of that. But in the process of coming to terms with that, you find yourself in this situation where everything has to be interrogated and everything has to be autopsied. So one of the things that happened, this is the last event of the Canadian leg of the tour. We've been at this for a week and a half, is that right? Something like that, and it takes a toll talking about this stuff, right? Like it's not, you know, not woe is me or whatever. I'm incredibly grateful for this, but you're coming back again and again to this notion of like, what is this? What is this good for? And I say somewhere in the book that I'm not trying to argue with anyone. You know, we're both Arabs. You've seen Arabs argue. People leave the room. They get scared, right? Like we're yelling at each other, and looks we're about, you know, it gets heated, and then right afterwards we like go break our fast together, and it's totally cool, right? Like it's just a very, like I love to argue. It's amazing. And if we're talking about urban planning, yeah, we're talking about 99.9% of subject matter. Absolutely, let's argue and get in each other's faces. I don't want to argue with you about a genocide. Yeah. If we are on opposite sides of that argument, there's a chasm between us I can't bridge. And it's not that I have this hatred for you or that I have any emotion for you. There's just a leave-taking that happens there. And so there's been immense negative reaction to this book. And a lot of it has been valid. And a lot of the most valid criticism has actually come from the left. There's also been a reaction that clearly has come from people who have read the synopsis and have no idea what the hell is in this book. My friend was convinced a while back that Indigo wasn't going to carry it, and so kept refreshing the page, you know, and finally, months ahead of its publication, it shows up, and he's like, "Hey, check it out." And I was like, "I don't care. It doesn't matter." But so I look at this thing, and immediately it already had 2 reviews, and it was a 1-star and a 5-star, and neither person had read it. And it's that kind of thing, right? Like you know what ride you're in for, you know what you're gonna. But I'm not interested in this notion of I'm gonna try to reason you to a place that morally you wouldn't have gone to by yourself. Because, you know, it brings out in me all of those things that I talk about when I talk about the self-indictment of the centrist liberal, right? Which I was more than happy to adhere myself to. Mm-hmm. So, for example, this notion of you know, the horrible things that are happening to those people all the way over there, they're bad because one day they'll come to you. Like I find an almost magnetic lure to make that argument because I know that it has the best chance of working. You know, right now, yeah, it's the Palestinians and like really, like, you know, that's just what happens over there, and it's, but like, those pagers could have been on a plane, or you know, and you're casting forward to this hypothetical future where somebody whose life matters will have this happen to them. These are the kind of argumentative tools that I find myself drifting towards as soon as I start to think about this idea of the argument, if I'm going to bring you to my place. I didn't even reason myself into this place. I have a certain set of moral beliefs, and from those I extrapolate to the place I'm at. So I don't think of it as an argument, but clearly both the 1-star guy and the 5-star guy thought of it that way.
I think they were looking for an argument. I want to say that there's a tendency for the issue of Palestinian rights, Palestinian liberation, Palestine as an idea, as a concept, to be seen and deemed as inherently complicated, or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as inherently complicated, too complicated to be able to elaborate on, that it's something that is beyond kind of spatial explanation and temporal commitment. We just don't have the time to cover it. And that is a cop-out in the conversation. You've been a journalist for a good number of years and someone who has done, I would say, done a remarkable job trying to tell truths as you saw them in those contexts and in those scenarios, which also inadvertently meant that you were problematizing what you saw. You were telling readers and audiences and individuals who were engaging with your reporting that it's not as simple as you think it is. It's not so black and white. But somehow, right, when I read this book versus reading your journalism, I come to a distillation that when it comes to what we are witnessing and have witnessed over the last year and a half in Gaza, it is not complicated. Can you tell me a little bit more about how we can entertain the idea that this is such a simple dynamic? How do we arrive at the conclusion that this cannot be a contestation? It cannot be an argument over whether or not you think, Palestinians have the right to exist or be remembered or have a national identity or to, fly a flag or to have national clothes or have a language or a dialect or their own food,
So this book launched on the 25th, I think, of February. And we did the launch in Portland, where I live. We did it at Powell's, and afterwards I was driving home and I was listening to NPR. And they were doing a segment on the Republicans trying to cut Medicare. And the interviewer said something like, this Republican lawmaker says that 50% of all Medicare expenditures are fraud. And it was interviewing this, the interview was with a person who actually has to have a relationship with reality. She's a researcher who actually has to and you could tell this woman was just having trouble, not saying, hey, that's complete bullshit, like they say. And instead she was like, well, we have no evidence of this whatsoever. What we do have is, when we do the research, is that there's approximately 5% billing errors. And what was interesting is what the interviewer said next, which was something like, well, you say 5%, this lawmaker says 50%. Is there not a middle ground there? And I'm watching, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, like, this is the model. This is the predominant model, and it works perfectly on a level playing field where people are operating in good faith. As soon as that's not the case, this thing is falling apart completely. I came up around journalists, right? I think most of them are working their asses off, and they're trying very, very hard. It's not a job you get into for the money. It's got one of the highest divorce rates of any profession. You get yelled at constantly by strangers. My issue is not with the notion of something being complicated. Everything is complicated in some way or another if you think about it hard enough. My issue is with the distance between the story as it would be written in a vacuum with no external pressures applied, and the story when it is written under those pressures. And by pressures, I mean the threat of a company pulling its advertising, or no longer giving you access to the CEO because they don't like something you've written, or your editor-in-chief getting angry at you, or those strangers yelling at you on the internet, or your career getting derailed and now you're doing real estate listings because they don't trust you to cover your beat anymore. And the only question I think every journalist, myself included, needs to ask themselves with respect to every story is, what is the distance between those? What is the distance between the story as you would have written it in a vacuum and the story as you have written it under these pressures? Because that distance is the definition of journalistic malpractice. And it happens to be the case that this is especially glaring in the situation in Gaza and as it relates to Palestinians generally for a very, very long time. again, I can't tell you that this book is good or bad. I don't have that kind of relationship with my work where I can tell you that. I can tell you that at least when I was writing it, I was trying my best to close that gap. Now, maybe the story in a vacuum was garbage, and maybe I don't know how to write it, and maybe all of that. But I couldn't commit to writing this kind of book and having that kind of gap. Whereas, to be perfectly honest, I'm sure there were many points in my journalism career where I was quite happy to let that gap grow, because my career aspirations got in the way, or who knows what the hell. So that's the only difference to me, anyway, in terms of the mode I was in when I was writing this book versus the mode that I was in for a lot of my journalism career.
Thank you for that. I think the other aspect of this book that I found to be incredibly profound and deeply touching on a very personal level, and I want to say really quickly, as Jorge was introducing us, I was thinking, my goodness, our biographies are actually kind of awfully similar. Yeah. It's just that I happen to conceal mine, you know, with writings and stuff like that. But we have a similar background, grew up in, you know, same part of the world, migrated in the same part of the world, parents who kind of are contemporaries in different ways. But as I was reading this book, I ended up finding that, I mean, initially I was hoping to learn about your reflections and contemplations and meditations and musings around the genocide from the standpoint of a journalist, and a writer and a novelist and what have you. And instead, what I ended up feeling is that you were holding the mirror up in front of all of us. I felt it was deeply personal to me because, you know, it was begging the question of, you know, and you weren't doing it in a preachy way, implying like, where were you when the Palestinians were being genocided in Gaza? But quite the contrary. It was sort of you grappling with what it means on a day-to-day basis and trying to...
You're getting the signal to keep it close.
I'm getting a signal?
Yeah.
All right.
No, just to keep it close to your...
Oh, almost done?
Yeah.
Close to my... Okay, all right, sorry. So I kept thinking to myself, this is about me. This is about where I stand. It's about my morality, my litmus testing, where I am in conjunction with this situation. It was also a story of struggling with one's morality and recognizing our inherent and collective failures, right? The fact that even if we commit ourselves to BDS, we are just not moving that handle far enough. That even though we might be saying all the right things, we are still part of institutions that are deeply entrenched in the continuation of the status quo. So I wanted to ask you, were you thinking about us as readers and the extent to which we might find your narration of your personal autobiographical experiences relatable, or were you just telling us how you feel in light of what was happening?
That's a really fascinating question. Also, I think my mic has just stopped working for some reason. Let me just switch. Is that? Hold on. Oh, there we go. All right, cool. So I tend to go back to this thing Ishiguro once said about all literature just being somebody saying, this is how it feels for me. Can you hear me? Does it also feel that way for you? And I think one of the reasons this book has gotten substantially more traction than I ever thought it would is because the answer to that last question, whether it's affirmative or negative, has been really sort of emphatic. Mm-hmm. It's produced emphatic answers to that question. But with respect to sort of what I hope the reader would take away from it, or how that sort of reflects in the reading, it's not my first rodeo. It's my third rodeo, which is not that many rodeos, but I've been to 2 other rodeos. And the same thing has happened in both cases, which is the book I thought I had written and the many, many books that people read were entirely different things. The story I always go back to is with American War. My first novel was a book called American War. The middle segment of that book takes place in a camp for internally displaced southern U.S. residents, and it's called Camp Patience. And most everything that happens in that section, especially the sort of culminating event, is based very, very closely on Sabra and Shatia, the Palestinian refugee camp where there was a massacre some 40 years ago. Sabr is the Arabic word for patience, that's where that name comes from. But in this part of the world, you're not taught that in high school. Like, most people don't get that reference at all. And so I would constantly, when I was doing book clubs in this part of the world, I would be asked, why did you have to make it so brutal? And I would explain, some of the lines of dialogue are from witness testimony. Like, the tether is short. But I would get that question over and over again, why did you have to make it so brutal? And then I think I wrote about this in the book. It's stuck with me for a long time. I go do a virtual book club with an Egyptian group for whom Sabra and Shatia is not far away. And the first question is, well, if this is based on Sabra and Shatia, why did you tone it down so much? They'd read an entirely different book. And so you have to kind of preemptively brace for that to happen. Even in nonfiction, right? Like, a novel you read it a million different ways. But the different parts of this that people have latched onto, it's run the gamut. I had a journalist interview me for the Canadian media swing, and she said it made her want to quit her job. And I take that as a real compliment. And I shouldn't. This person's
You're putting journalism out of business.
Yeah, exactly. I shouldn't.
More than it is.
I shouldn't take so much glee in that, but I'm a petty person. What can I say? I don't know. There's this principle in architecture where every architect has to, should give some thought to any structure they build. They should give some thought as to how it would look as ruins. And I think writers would do well to think of their books in similar terms. And I have no idea what this looks like as ruins. Because the moment, we were talking about this backstage, about on the other side of this last year and a half, I'm an entirely different person. Like, you either understand that implicitly or you don't, and I can't explain it to you, right? And so to be writing in the middle of that transformation is, in a very petty, self-centered way, a very dangerous thing, right? And then suddenly the book launches and you're public facing, and you don't have time to just sit with it and think, how does this die? What does old age look like for a book like this? But it was a very specific sort of intentional thing on my part to not try to preemptively cater to closing the gap between the book I was writing and the many possible interpretations, which is something that hurt me on my second novel. I had that in the back of my head of, oh my God, I'm trying this thing, but they might read it this way, and it made for a worse book. So even if it wasn't for the state I was in and continue to be in, when I was writing this and now, even just on a craft level, I think at some point you have to sort of shed that obligation to match the million different books that your book is eventually going to become.
It's an extraordinary explanation of your sort of cerebral and cognitive, journey of trying to figure out how to tell these stories. I will say though that as I was reading this, I felt as though I wasn't just accompanying you in this journey, but rather that it was a parallel journey. That what you were witnessing, describing, feeling, your affect, and the way in which you were sort of consecrating and documenting your experiences with the world transforming around you is something that I think everybody in this room would find extremely relatable. This is why events on Palestine are so incredibly full. They are the most attended events I've ever witnessed. I've been in the academy for 25 years. I've never seen a subject matter get this much attention in all of my time within the academy. Honestly. And I think it's a function of the fact that we are looking for a way to not only comprehend the genocide of a people at a time where it is deemed not only appropriate, but rather preferable, right? And trying to reconcile where we fit vis-a-vis a collapsing world order. And so your book is one that, in reading, it is cathartic in one sense for the reader, but it's also quite inspiring because it allows us to find the language that we are very much at odds with. We're struggling. I mean, even though I write for a living, but I cannot, for the life of me, imagine being able to produce a work of such effective elegance that really speaks to the heart and soul in a way that that is not only deeply touching, but incredibly meaningful. So I just wanted to say that we are with you in this journey, even though you might have written it for audiences, but I don't think that I interacted with this book as an audience member. Quite the contrary, I felt that in a way, I might actually be the author, which is a very unusual and peculiar relationship with a book. How many of you have read books and thought, wait a minute, I think I could have written this, I just can't, I can't and I will never be able to write this, but thank you for writing the book that I would have loved to write my whole life, I wanted to ask you about representation. This is something we kind of discussed backstage a few minutes ago, but representation, I mean, there's the constant discussion about why aren't communities represented? What does it mean to be represented? Why are we underrepresented? Why are we misrepresented? And I think that for many of us who come from communities that have been misrepresented or negatively depicted or challenged in some way, particularly given the architecture of power and the colonial relationships and geopolitics of all of this. We've sort of been hanging on to this idea that there is a right way for us to be represented and for these issues to be represented. One of the things that I've often found interesting was the late Edward Said's writings. I mean, he wrote a lot of remarkable things, but in some of his more personal narratives, he talks about how, as a Palestinian, when he would look back at the photographs of his family, the black and white photos taken in the 40s and 50s during a time of displacement and the aftermath of the Nakba, the first Nakba, now that we're talking about subsequent Nakbas, that when he looks at those photos, he realizes how much is missing, how much is outside the frame, how much is not captured, how much is excised. And he reflects that the very act of representation is inherently violent. And I've often thought about this in light of both journalism, the one's incapacitation, that inability to render the complexity and the nuances of what you witness and turn it into, now an ever-shrinking amount of text that you're going to get in a print publication. And the same is true with almost everything else that we do, whether it's reducing it to a tweet, rendering it a status, shooting a short reel. Everything has become so reductive, so short, so abbreviated, so abridged. And so the question that I have is, what does it mean to push back against this?
So early on in the book, I chose to tell this story of when I was about 15, 16 years old. My buddy has just gotten his driver's license, and we're driving around. This was in Doha, the capital of Qatar. Qatar is a little peninsula sticking out of Saudi Arabia, pound for pound, the richest place on earth. This is where I grew up. And Qatar is 90% non-Qatari. People have come from somewhere else to cash in on the oil and gas money. And the vast majority of those people are so-called third country laborers. These are people who, predominantly from India, Pakistan, Nepal, the Philippines, they built the place. They built the entirety of the place, and they're treated like absolute garbage. Just subhuman conditions. And we're driving by one day, we're driving down the road, and a man, Southeast Asian, gets into a fender bender with the Mercedes of this Qatari guy. Qatar guy comes out and is just livid and takes off his sandal and starts beating this guy in the middle of the street, and everybody's slowing down so that they can gawk and honk their horns. And we're part of this, right? We're part of this. And you know, you think back on it, I keep returning to that memory, and recently it came to me, and I think I talk about it in the book. What this guy had done was not get into a slight fender bender with a Mercedes. He had violated the conditions of his own non-existence. He was there to build the sail-shaped skyscrapers and to do the manual labor and to be non-existent outside of those confines. And once he stepped outside of that, that became almost existential, right? The whole thing could fall apart. The whole enterprise, the way the society is structured, could fall apart if suddenly this group of human beings are allowed to be human. And because I've been a guest on someone else's land since I was 5 years old, I've lived in a lot of very different places, and I've carried that with me, either consciously or subconsciously, as an assessment of the society I'm in. For this, whatever it is, to work, who needs to be subhuman? Who needs to be non-human? Who needs to not exist in any kind of way that is synonymous with agency? And I keep coming back to this, right? Because every society has that version. Every society. When you're talking backstage, if you had told me 2 years ago what would it take to bring you back to Qatar, I would have been like, no, there's nothing you can offer me. I'm not going back. And now for the first time in my life, I'm like, you know, if I wasn't married and didn't have kids and have root here, like maybe. My opinion of Qatar hasn't changed. You know, I'm not. My capacity to live atop a surface layer held up by people I have to continuously think of as subhuman or non-human has changed. I used to teach this class on political fiction, whatever the hell that is, and I used to begin by saying, man, all fiction is political, right? It's political by virtue of its active space or its negative space, what you choose to tackle directly or what you feel safe ignoring. And just as a sort of, you know, mini exercise for the students, I would say think of any book at all, any novel. Find a way to fit the word Palestinian into that title and tell me what you think is going to happen to the publishing process of that book. Tell me what you think is going to happen to the publishing process of the Palestinian Da Vinci Code. I'm not changing anything else. That's all we're doing. This enforced non-existence is fundamental to the entire enterprise. And it allows for so many side benefits if you are on the asymmetrical power center of that relationship. Because one of the things you can do is then present the plainly nonsensical argument that because this group is so confined, the horrible things happening here are going to stay here. Which inevitably brings them out with the counter argument of like, no, it might again happen to somebody who's, it absolutely will, right? Like,
it is.
We're seeing it right now, you know. But B, even if it didn't, that makes it no less morally repugnant. I remember the first time Trump came into power when he was running against Hillary Clinton, he was musing about making American Muslims carry special ID cards. Anyone who has a passing knowledge of history is aware of what that tends to be a prelude to.
Or how close we are to that.
Or how close we are to that. And Clinton and a bunch of other Democrats were asked about this. And when she was asked about this, her immediate response segued into how American Muslims are a really important ally in the fight against terror. And you think, that's your reason for opposing this? That's what... You can't do this unless you have worked that muscle that allows you to think of certain groups of people at certain points in time as being non-human, as not having met the basic moral threshold, which when applied to any other group of human beings, you would immediately cause you to make the obvious moral argument. This is repugnant. Every time I see someone resort to the pragmatic there is a part of me that's, I think, connected to my own survival instinct that starts to freak the hell out.
Well, of course, because the forced non-existence can be applicable to anyone at any time. Look at the extent to which anyone with privilege can lose privilege with a flick of a button simply for standing up on this issue. The head of the the judges of the ICC, the ICJ, every single human rights organization now outright condemned international law being scrapped. There isn't a single individual in this world not immune from condemnation and active and functional erasure for standing up on this issue. So, you know, initially it might have been sort of racialized communities. Of course, there was the good Arab and the bad Arab and those sort of dynamics. But now it doesn't matter. I mean, look at the incredible work that's being done by, you know, Jewish communities who are opposed to the genocide, and the manner in which they are, you know, at the very least admonished and described as self-hating Jews, along with various other sort of analogous, you know, profanities against selfhood and collective identity, but and with no room for any kind of liberationist, you know, approach to seeing the world. So in my thinking, I'm concerned that there is no room left for anyone. But I'm also shocked and flabbergasted at the extent to which it took this one issue. What is it about Palestine that makes it such a critical turning point whereby those in power are prepared to do away with every aspect of liberal I mean, that even if it were to be an illusion, that the illusion itself would be done away with and put through a shredder to preserve this sort of golden cow?
I mean, I think it comes back to that idea of what liberation is, right? Like, we live these incredibly siloed existence, particularly in this part of the world, but I don't think in any other part of the world it's not there, where you are afforded the privilege of not caring about the person next to you. But liberation can't exist that way. It just can't. There is no such thing as this kind of selective freedom. That's not freedom. I think with respect to this issue in particular, at least for me, and you know, I've heard all of the like patently bad faith arguments of like, oh, why do you care about this and not Sudan or not? You don't care about Sudan, buddy. You don't. You're trying to get me to shut up. This is what's happening, what's actually happening here. You know, the last year and a half has been a real crash course on not bothering to engage with obviously bad faith arguments. It's a real skill set you have to build up. I don't know, like, I know that this isn't normal for me, right? I get 3 people at my events. I know what's, like, there's a sense of like a collective anger and a need to vent and just the space, right? Just the space that's drawing people here. And I can't speak for anyone in this room. I can speak for myself. What has felt fundamentally different about the last year and a half, to me, comes down to 3 things. Intimacy, immediacy, and complicity. You know, I wake up and I watch the most intimate horror. Yeah. Like, I now know what it looks like when a little girl starves to death. And I'd seen horrors before. But that's where the immediacy comes in. This is happening in real time in front of me. And then on top of that, the complicity, I'm paying for it, I'm doing that. And I can't get away from it. And to be honest, when I go back to this cowardly part of me, there is a cowardly part of me that just wants to look away. Right? You know, one of the safest things you can do in the short term right now is just keep your head down. Just wait. Like, honestly, the title of the book is the title of the book for a reason. Right? It'll be safe one day. But I don't think that, at least in my case, you can see this happening before your eyes. you can be presented, and I mean, like, I'm a storyteller, that's all I know how to do. I was watching a documentary once with this guy, about this guy who had memorized pi to like 8 billion digits, and they did this experiment where they were just reading it back to him, and when they got to like the 800th digit, they deliberately changed it to something wrong, and when they said it, you could see him wince. I have that with stories. When a narrative container is full of shit, when the narrative doesn't make sense, I have a sort of gut reaction. And so you're watching this horror, and you're being handed a narrative container that's supposed to make this okay, and it's not working. I don't know how to be functional in my capacity to ignore anymore. I just don't know. And so, you know, I talk about this book, and it's, I don't know if it's going to do a damn thing, but like, this is all I could think about, and it's all I could write about. And if I sit there and think, well, yeah, just let the storm pass, and then afterwards, you know, you can write really moving stories about the horror. I don't know that I could call myself a writer. I'm engaged in something else, but I don't think it's something that fits my definition of what a writer does. We're supposed to say something about what it means to be human. And my education, in the most horrible ways, in what it means to be human has been an immense one over the last year and a half. We have narrative sort of trajectories. We have pattern recognition. We know how this sort of thing goes. We saw it. I came of age, I was 19 when September 11th happened. A lot of my early adult life was in the war on terror, post-war on terror years. And you see the narrative arc, and it always begins with silence. But then the door slides open a tiny bit, and who comes crawling through it first? The former Marine who wants to write the short story collection about how sad it made him to go to Iraq and kill all those brown people. Right? Like, you know the narrative arc is one day going to get to a place where there's an honest accounting. You just have to go through a lot of bullshit first. You can't experience that and come out the other side the same. And any argument you give me about how this is necessary, or that there's a worse evil on the other side of it if we don't do this, or all of that, is going to change fundamentally the reaction to listening to a 6-year-old girl beg for her life before Israeli soldiers shoot that car 355 times. It's just not. And so we're here.
Thank you. Thank you for producing a book that punctures the pomposity of power and pierces through so much bullshit to produce something very raw, very honest, and deeply human. I want to invite you, if it's okay with you, to just read a short passage of your choosing from the book, just to help us conclude.
Let's do this. So a few months ago, the people at Penguin Random House's audio division called up, and they were like, we can't get anyone else to read this thing. Like, we're not going to do that to them. These are hard-working voice actors. They don't deserve this. So you got to do it. So I wandered into a studio in Portland, and these two poor sound engineers had to sit with me and just go through it. I don't have much experience with that kind of work, but I did do a podcast that nobody listened to, but I did the podcast for a year and a half, and the whole time I was doing this podcast, the producers would keep saying, like, yeah, okay, can you, like, perk it up a little bit, or just give us a little bit more energy, like, sound like you want to be here, just something. And I'd be like, no, you obviously don't know me. That's not going to happen. But then the funny thing is I went to the studio to read this, and they were like, you're perfect. This is exactly the correct vibe to be bringing to this project. So that's what you're in for. I spent a month and a half, I think, maybe more, on the prologue, which is longer than I spent on anything else, which I think is the case for a lot of writers. Like your first few pages, you just hammer away at for a while. But anyway, I'm going to read you. I'm going to try to read you the prologue. Hold on. You think I'd done this enough to know, like, the hand microphone? All right, this will work. She is fog-colored when they find her. She believes she has ended. Like porters in service of some grotesque nobility, half a dozen men carry the stretcher out of something cavernous, something that used to be a home. And she, a girl of 9 or 10, is whisked away. Sitting on the stretcher, dazed and bloodied, she looks off to the side. She appears to be searching. The men who carry the stretcher move with urgency, as if the doing of care, of gentleness, can undo what has happened to this girl, to this place, to the bodies yet to be dug from beneath the rubble. Someone nearby asks God for revenge. Perhaps God is here somewhere, also searching. A soldier I met years ago, who made the study of industrial violence his hobby, once told me that the first thing that kills when a bomb goes off isn't shrapnel or fire. It's the overpressure wave, air forced violently outward from the site of the blast. What you're supposed to do, he said, is drop to the ground and cover your ears. Breathe out. Empty your lungs before the air collides with and flattens them. Of course, if you're close enough, nothing you do or don't do will make any difference at all. He said the force of the overpressure wave weakens in proportion to the cube of the distance from the site of impact, which is to say, the most effective thing you can do to avoid getting killed by a missile or a mine or a grenade is to be far away when it goes off. How do you do that, I asked. Do what? Know when a thing like that is about to happen. Know to be far away. Well, he said, and trailed off. A few minutes later, he was telling the story of a freak accident his daughter had suffered as a toddler, how carrying her to the emergency room was the scariest thing he'd ever experienced. Even in his line of work, even with all he'd seen, the scariest thing. As the men carry the girl out of what used to be her home, she asks if they're going to take her to the cemetery. One of the men says, "Masha'Allah, Masha'Allah." In literal translation, the word means what God wills. A closer approximation of meaning, of one meaning, is something like, what has happened is what God willed. But English, tasked with a word like this, turns stiff and monophonic, and Masha'Allah is orchestral. To any ear that grew up on this language, it is clear that what the man means when he says this word is something else entirely, something instantly familiar to generations who've heard it spilling out the mouths of beaming grandmothers at the end of piano recitals and graduation ceremonies and at the first sight of a newborn. Used this way, it finds its principal purpose as an expression of joy. Look at this wonderful thing God has done. MashaAllah. Language, too, forces the air from the lungs. Beyond the high walls and barbed wire and checkpoints that pen this place, there is the empire. And the empire as well is cocooned inside its own fortress of language, a language through the prism of which buildings are never destroyed but rather spontaneously combust, in which blasts come and go like Chinooks over the mountain, and people are killed as though to be killed is the only natural and rightful ordering of their existence, as though living was the aberration. And this language might protect the empire's most bloodthirsty fringe, but the fringe has no use for linguistic malpractice. It is instead the middle, the liberal, well-meaning, easily upset middle, that desperately needs the protection this kind of language provides. Because it is the middle of the empire that must look upon this and say, yes, this is tragic but necessary, because the alternative is barbarism. The alternative to the countless killed and maimed and orphaned and left without home, without school, without hospital, and the screaming from under the rubble, and the corpses disposed of by vultures and dogs, and the days-old babies left to scream and starve, is barbarism. The girl on the stretcher believes she has ended. A man says to her, Inti zay al-qamar, you are like the moon. Again, translation fails. There is no English equivalent to the lineage of this phrase, a lineage that runs through generations of old movies and love songs and family gatherings. Listen to the sly setting joy and pleading, raw pleading, that carries the words as this man tells the girl who lived when so many others died that she is beautiful beyond the bounds of this world. Zay al-Qamar. Something has ended here, but something else begins. The dead dig wells in the living.